The city was dying. Berlin, April 30th, 1945. Smoke curled upward from every street like the breath of a dying beast, the sky a sheet of gray ash swallowing the sun. Apartment blocks groaned as they burned, their facades collapsing in slow motion under the concussion of Russian artillery. Somewhere beyond the Tiergarten, the last Panzerfausts screamed their final defiance before vanishing in clouds of dust. In the cellars, civilians prayed beneath flickering candles, their voices drowned by the endless thunder. Above them, in the choking ruins of the government quarter, the remnants of the SS Nordland Division were preparing to die. They had no armor left. No air support. Barely a few hundred men remained. Scandinavians, Latvians, Dutch, even a handful of Frenchmen who had once believed they were fighting for Europe's future. Now they were fighting for minutes. Down Wilhelmstrasse, a single T-34 roared through the smoke. Its turret turned, the barrel lowering toward the shattered line of defenders. Boys in blackened field gray, eyes hollow, uniforms torn. An officer barked something in Danish, his voice hoarse. "Hold your fire. Wait for my mark." When the tank emerged fully, they rose together like ghosts from the rubble, each man knowing it was useless. A rocket streaked from the shadow of a burned tram, slamming into the T-34's side. The blast painted the ruins orange. Flames spilled from the hatch. A figure crawled halfway out, burning alive. The men of Nordland didn't cheer. They just reloaded, because behind that tank were 10 more, and behind them 1,000,000 Soviet soldiers closing in on the heart of the Reich. In the Führer bunker, the radio whispered rumors of surrender. But here, on the streets of Berlin, surrender didn't exist. Only one word mattered now: stand. They came from everywhere. From Oslo and Copenhagen, from Riga, from the smoky backstreets of Rotterdam and the ruined tenements of Warsaw, drawn by propaganda, revenge, fear, or the hope that fighting for Germany meant fighting against Bolshevism itself. The 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland was never truly German. It was a Frankenstein legion stitched together from the fragments of a dying ideology. By April 1945, what remained of Nordland was trapped inside Berlin. Its foreign volunteers, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Dutch, Flemings, Balts, fought not for conquest anymore, but for survival. For them, there would be no surrender, no retreat across friendly borders. The Reich's heart had become their tomb. The streets around the Anhalter Bahnhof were already smoking ruins when Major Rudolf Tolsdorf of Nordland's artillery regiment led his men through the rubble. Shells fell every 30 seconds, shaking the ground like the heartbeat of an angry god. Broken trams lay twisted across the intersections. Civilians stumbled between the cracks, white flags torn from bed linen fluttering uselessly in the wind. The men of Nordland ignored them. Orders were clear: hold Berlin at all costs. But what cost meant was beyond comprehension now. They were down to a few thousand men spread across a dozen shattered blocks. Half their heavy weapons were gone. Ammunition was counted in individual rounds. And the Red Army, at nearly 2 million strong, had surrounded the city in a ring of iron and fire. In the ruins of a former post office near the Potsdamer Platz, SS Brigadeführer Joachim Ziegler, the division's commander, stood over a map lit by a single kerosene lantern. The paper shook with every distant detonation. His uniform, once immaculate, was covered in soot. He looked to his adjutant Sturmbannführer Fritz Hendrickson, a Danish officer who had fought since Narva. "How many left in Norge regiment?" Ziegler asked. Hendrickson hesitated. 83 fit for action. Maybe 100 if we count the walking wounded. Ziegler closed his eyes. Out of 2,000. Silence. The men in the room could hear the rain of mortar shells on the roof. At last, Ziegler straightened. "The Führer expects us to defend Wilhelmstrasse to the last. He says the Nordland Division will be the shield of the capital." Hendrickson smiled grimly. "Then we are a shield of ashes." No one laughed. Outside, the men of Nordland moved through the city like phantoms. They had fought in the east for 3 years, at Leningrad, Narva, Tannenberg Line. They had seen entire battalions erased by artillery, cities swallowed by fire. But Berlin was different. This was not the front. It was the end of the world. Corporal Egil Amlien, a 20-year-old Norwegian from Trondheim, leaned against the ruins of a department store, listening to the distant scream of Katyusha rockets. His hands shook as he loaded a Panzerfaust. Beside him, Private Hans Keller from Hamburg murmured, "They say the Russians execute everyone from Nordland. No prisoners." Amlian nodded slowly. "We deserve it." Keller looked at him surprised. Amlian shrugged. "I've seen what we did in the East. Maybe this is payment." A shell burst down the street, showering them with dust. They didn't move. There was nowhere left to go. By evening, Ziegler was called to the chancellery. Inside the bunker complex, the air was thick with diesel fumes and desperation. Hitler's circle, Goebbels, Bormann, the remaining SS staff, still spoke of counter-offensives that existed only on paper. When Ziegler was told that his division was to hold the government district until relieved, he understood what that meant. There would be no relief. On his way out, he passed General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, face drawn, eyes blank. Keitel didn't speak. No one did. The silence of doom hung over the corridors like a fog. Back at the front line on Wilhelmstrasse, a young Danish machine gunner named Carl Nielsen sat in a cellar with his squad, writing his last letter. The paper was torn from a ration box. "Mother," he wrote, "if you hear this, know that I fought as I was taught. They say we fight for Europe, but here I see only smoke and death. If I don't come home, burn my uniform and forget my name." He folded the note, tucked it into his breast pocket, and checked the belt on his MG-42. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. Around him, men shared cigarettes in the flicker of a candle, the faces of every nationality fused by the same grim resolve. The next day, April 28th, the Soviets launched their final assault. Artillery barrages rolled over the city like the sound of tearing metal. T-34s and IS-2s pushed through the southern districts, their tracks crushing bodies and rubble alike. Nordland's positions at the Anhalter Bahnhof and Wilhelmstrasse were the last obstacles between the Red Army and the Chancellery. Ziegler stood in the open as the first shells fell, shouting orders that were instantly drowned by explosions. The ground heaved beneath him. Telephone lines snapped. Machine gun crews were blown apart, and the air turned white with dust and cordite. When the bombardment stopped, what remained of Nordland rose from the debris and fired back. Rockets, rifles, grenades, a hopeless symphony of defiance. Hendrickson was hit in the chest by shrapnel. He fell without a sound. Ziegler knelt beside him, pressing a hand to the wound, but there was nothing to be done. Blood soaked through his fingers. "Save the others," Hendrickson whispered. Then he was gone. Ziegler stood up, face expressionless, and walked back to the line. The division had no more medics, no more hope, only orders. By nightfall, the Russians had cut through to the Reichstag. Nordland was splintered into pockets of resistance, each surrounded, each fighting alone. Every street became a battlefield. Every basement a last stand. Ziegler gathered his remaining officers in a cellar beneath the Ministry of Public Works. The electric lights were dead. Candles flickered on maps stained with blood and coffee. "We have 90 men left," he said quietly. "The Russians are closing from the north and south. Our only chance is to break out west toward the Tiergarten and try for the Elbe." A young Swede, Lieutenant Sven Kellström, spoke up. "Sir, the Führer has ordered us to fight to the last man." Ziegler looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "So we will. But we choose where." At dawn, May 1st, they moved through the Tiergarten under a ceiling of smoke so thick it turned the sun red. Birds had stopped singing. The trees were shredded by shrapnel. The paths were carpeted with spent shells and the bodies of civilians who had tried to run. They crossed a canal on a makeshift bridge of planks and doors. On the other side, a Soviet platoon appeared suddenly through the smoke. Red stars on helmets, bayonets fixed. The two forces stared at each other for a heartbeat. Then the world erupted. Machine gun bursts ripped through the trees. Flames licked the trunks as grenades detonated. Ziegler was hit in the leg but kept moving. Pistol firing until the magazine clicked empty. They fought their way to the Zooflak Tower, a fortress of concrete and steel still holding out under Major General Helmuth Weidling's orders. Inside they found hundreds of wounded men and civilians, the air stinking of blood and diesel. When word came that Hitler was dead, no one spoke. Some crossed themselves, others simply stared at the floor. Ziegler sat against the wall, eyes glazed. "We're free now," he murmured. "Free to die for ourselves." The Zooflak Tower loomed like a black fortress over the ruins of Berlin. A concrete colossus rising from the wreckage, its walls pitted by tank shells, its guns still glinting under the dull gray sky. To the civilians sheltering within, it was the last island of safety in a city that had become an inferno. To the soldiers of the SS Nordland Division, it was a tomb waiting to seal itself shut. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, diesel fumes, and the metallic tang of cordite. Wounded men lay shoulder to shoulder in corridors that smelled of iodine and rot. The dull thunder of artillery never stopped. Each blast sent dust raining from the ceiling. Somewhere deep below, the generator groaned, threatening to die at any moment. Captain Egil Amlien, one of the last surviving Norwegian officers, moved through the packed interior, his boots crunching on spent shells. He passed nurses with blood-smeared hands, children sleeping in corners, old women clutching small dogs wrapped in towels. The sound of weeping echoed down the stairwells like whispers from another world. On the upper floor, the gunners of the 12.8 cm flak battery were still firing. Their target was invisible, just a wall of smoke and the muffled roar of Russian armor beyond the Tiergarten. Every shell fired made the entire tower shake. The floor vibrated beneath Amlien's boots as he reached the command level. Brigade Führer Ziegler was there, leg bandaged, sitting at a table littered with maps, empty morphine vials, and half-burned cigarettes. His face looked carved from stone. Around him, fragments of the Nordland staff were arguing, voices raised, desperate. They're surrounding the tower from the south. There's no way out. The 18th Panzer Grenadiers surrendered yesterday and will be next. Ziegler slammed his fist on the table. Enough! The room fell silent. He spoke quietly, the calm of a man already beyond fear. General Weidling has ordered all remaining units to hold their positions. We will not surrender until the civilians are evacuated. If the Russians want this tower, they'll pay for every step. Amlien nodded, though he knew it was madness. They all did, but madness was the only thing left that resembled purpose. At noon, Soviet artillery began a new barrage, the heaviest yet. The walls trembled as shells pounded the surrounding park, cratering the earth into a smoking wasteland. The defenders of the flak tower could see through the observation slits the red tide advancing. Endless lines of infantry supported by tanks, flamethrowers, and field guns. The tower's big guns opened up again, the recoil slamming through the concrete like the heartbeat of the city itself. Each shot sent a shockwave that rattled loose chunks of plaster. Shell casings rolled across the floor like brass coins from some ancient cursed treasure. From the roof, Amlien watched the city burning. To the east, the Reichstag was already half ruined, a skeleton wrapped in smoke. The Brandenburg Gate stood crooked, one of its horses missing. Fires reflected in the river like veins of molten light. Everywhere he looked, the war was ending, not in victory or even defeat, but in exhaustion. He turned as another officer climbed up from below, Lieutenant Carl Nielsen, his face gray with fatigue. They're broadcasting surrender messages on the loudspeakers again, Nielsen said. They say Hitler's dead. That General Krebs is negotiating with the Russians. Amlien stared at him. Do you believe it? Nielsen hesitated. I don't know what to believe anymore. The sky flashed. A Soviet shell burst close, throwing both men against the parapet. Dust filled the air, blinding them. When it cleared, the anti-air gun beside them was a mangled wreck. Two of the crew were dead, their bodies shredded by shrapnel. Amlien looked down at the twisted metal, the ruined faces. He had no tears left, only the mechanical instinct to reload, refire, survive another minute. Below, in the civilian levels, panic was spreading. A nurse named Gertrude Klein tried to calm a group of mothers clutching children as the floor shook. It will hold, she lied. The walls are 6 meters thick. But even she knew. Every impact brought them closer to being buried alive. Through the narrow ventilation shafts came the stench of burning oil, of death outside. Someone screamed that Russian troops had reached the zoo, that tanks were firing point blank at the entrances. A doctor pushed through the crowd, shouting, "Get those who can move to the lower levels." The upper floors won't last. Amlien arrived moments later, face blackened with soot. We're out of ammunition for the Flak guns, he said. Only small arms left, Ziegler nodded slowly. Then we fight as infantry again. He picked up his MP-40, checked the magazine, and limped toward the stairs. Evening fell, though in Berlin, there was no real night anymore. The fires turned the sky into a pulsing red glow that never faded. Soviet infantry swarmed through the Tiergarten, shouting, firing into windows, tossing grenades into every doorway. The defenders on the flak tower's perimeter fought until they were gone. Danes, Norwegians, Latvians, Germans, all reduced to silhouettes in the smoke. From the tower's lower gun deck, Amlian could see them falling one by one. He watched Lieutenant Kjellstrom dragged behind a half-destroyed Panther tank, his body limp, the last Nordic flag torn from his sleeve. Nielsen shouted over the noise, "They're bringing up flamethrowers." The next blast hit the base of the tower, sending a sheet of flame curling up the walls. Screams echoed up the stairwell. Amlian grabbed the nearest bucket, dousing what fires he could. His uniform steamed where it was scorched. The smell of burned flesh filled the corridors. Ziegler's voice came faintly through the chaos. "Hold your positions! Civilians first." Midnight. Inside the command level, the candles had burned down to stubs. Ziegler sat slumped at the table, staring at a photograph of his wife and daughter, taken in Danzig in 1941. He had not seen them since. Amlian entered quietly. "Sir, the civilians want to surrender. They say the Russians will spare them if we lay down arms." Ziegler nodded, not looking up. "They may be right. Let them go when the shooting stops. But my men stay here." He reached for his pistol, checked the chamber. "We promise to hold." "We will hold." Amlian swallowed hard. "There's no one left to hold for." Ziegler smiled faintly. "Then we hold for ourselves." At dawn on May 2nd, Soviet loudspeakers blared again through the ruins. "Attention, German soldiers. The war is over. Hitler is dead. Lay down your weapons. You will be treated with honor." No one answered. On the roof, the last Flyke crew stood beside their silent guns, staring eastward. Through the haze, they could see the red flags rising over the Reichstag. Amlian looked down into the street. Soviet infantry were gathering, hundreds of them, bayonets fixed, waiting for the signal to storm the tower. He turned to Ziegler. "Sir, we can't stop them." Ziegler nodded. His face was pale but calm. "Then we stop fighting." He pulled the photograph from his pocket, looked at it one last time and slid it into Amlian's hand. "Burn this for me. Don't let them take it." Before Amlian could speak, Ziegler stepped away, pressed his pistol to his temple, and fired. The shot echoed through the concrete corridors like a thunderclap. Amlian stood frozen. Around him, men lowered their weapons, some weeping, some staring blankly. Moments later, a Soviet officer's voice boomed from outside. "Cease fire or we will destroy the tower." Amlian walked to the parapet and raised a white cloth torn from a nurse's apron. The shooting stopped. The Soviets entered cautiously, weapons ready. The defenders, what few remained, were lined against the walls, too weak to resist. Amlian felt the muzzle of a rifle against his neck as he was searched. His pockets were emptied, his dog tags taken. The Russian officer, a major, looked at him curiously. "Nordland?" Amlian nodded. The major sighed, gestured to his men. "Take them. But don't shoot the civilians. That mercy, rare in those days, saved hundreds." By noon, the red flag flew from the roof of the Zoo Flak Tower. The last fortress of Berlin had fallen. Outside, the city was silent except for the crackle of fire and the distant rumble of tanks moving west. Civilians emerged from basements like ghosts, eyes hollow, clothes blackened with soot. They saw the SS men being marched away and did not speak. As Amlian was led through the ruins, he looked once more toward Wilhelmstrasse. Smoke still rose from the chancellery, where the war had devoured its own masters. He whispered under his breath, "It's over." The Soviet guard beside him spat into the dust. "For you, maybe." And then they walked on, past the smoldering statues, the shattered trams, and the skeletal trees of the Tiergarten, through a city that had ceased to exist. The fall of the Zoo Flak Tower did not end the war for everyone. For those still alive from the SS Nordland Division, surrender meant captivity, and captivity in Soviet hands meant death. So while most of Berlin was surrendering, a handful of Nordland survivors refused. They would not die in the tower. They would try to break out. Among them was Obersturmführer Egil Amlian, his face still streaked with soot, his uniform stripped of insignia. Around him, 40 men gathered in the shadows of the Tiergarten, their eyes sunken, their weapons salvaged from corpses. They were not an army anymore, just a fragment of one. bound by desperation. The rumor had spread through the ruins like wildfire. We can still reach the Elbe. The Americans are there. The Elbe River, 100 kilometers west, had become the final dream for thousands of Germans trapped in Berlin. Crossing to the American lines meant survival. Staying meant Siberia or the firing squad, so they moved. Through the ruins, through the smoke, through the corpses of a city that had stopped breathing. The first night, they reached the Charlottenburg district. The streets were a graveyard of trams, their steel frames twisted, their windows melted into black streaks. The air smelled of wet ash and cordite. They passed burned-out Panthers, SS trucks overturned like toys, and civilians dragging carts loaded with whatever they could salvage. Food, blankets, family photographs. Amlian spoke softly to his men. No insignia, no SS armbands. If the Russians catch us, we're dead. If the civilians see us, they'll turn us in. He tore the runes from his collar, the eagle from his breast pocket. Others followed, silent and ashamed. For the first time since joining Nordland, they were anonymous, nameless soldiers without a cause. They reached the Spree River just before dawn. The bridges were gone, blown apart during the final battles. The water below was black, choked with debris and bodies. A young Swede named Anders Larsson whispered, "How do we cross?" Amlian pointed to a half-submerged barge trapped between the pylons. That. They waded in, the cold biting like knives. The current pulled at their legs, but they climbed aboard, hands numb, dragging rifles and wounded. One man slipped, a Dane named Madsen, and was swept under. No one could save him. The river swallowed him whole. They reached the opposite bank at sunrise, collapsing behind the ruins of a brewery. The city stretched endlessly behind them, smoke, silence, and the faint, endless rumble of Soviet tanks. By the second day, they were deep in the western suburbs. Everywhere they turned, columns of Soviet infantry were moving in, blocking the routes. The men hid in gardens, basements, and half-collapsed homes. They scavenged bread from abandoned kitchens, drank rainwater from helmets. Amlian kept a small map folded in his breast pocket, lines drawn in pencil showing the path to Spandau, where the Havel River crossed westward. Beyond that was open countryside. As they moved through the wreckage of a tram depot, they heard gunfire. Not Soviet, but sharp, sporadic, from just beyond the next street. Amlian signaled his men down. He crept forward, peered around a corner. A group of Volkssturm, old men and teenagers with armbands and hunting rifles, were firing at a patrol of Soviet scouts. One of the boys, barely 16, was screaming, "They're coming! They're coming!" Amlian could see the Russians flanking through a courtyard, about to wipe them out. He turned back to his men. "We go through the alley, fast. Don't engage." But the boys saw them, mistook them for reinforcements.
SS, help us!
"Please." The moment froze. The Russians turned. Gunfire erupted. Amlian shouted, "Down!" Bullets shredded the walls. One of his men fell, clutching his throat. Another stumbled backward, hit in the chest. Amlian returned fire, short bursts, precise, mechanical. The Soviet patrol broke, 2 men down, the rest vanishing behind the smoke. The street fell silent again. The boy with the armband crawled toward Amlian, eyes wide. "You saved us," he whispered. Amlian looked at him, then at the bodies of his own men. "No," he said. "We saved no one. They left before the Russians returned." By nightfall, they reached Spandau, or what was left of it. The town was half burned, its streets littered with wreckage. The Havel glistened beyond the ruins, wide and slow under the moonlight. On the far bank, faint tracer fire marked Soviet patrols. They needed a way across. In the ruins of a boathouse, they found an old rowboat riddled with bullet holes. Larsson patched it with tar and rags while the others gathered planks for oars. The wind was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of decay. Amlian looked at the men, barely 30 now. "2 at a time," he said, silent. No light, they pushed off. The oars dipped soundlessly into the dark water. Every ripple sounded like thunder. Halfway across, a flare burst overhead, white, blinding. Machine guns opened up from the far bank. The river erupted in splashes. Larsson screamed, "Get down!" But it was too late. Bullets tore through the boat. Water rushed in. Amlian threw himself overboard, dragging a wounded man with him. They kicked for the shore, lungs burning, bullets snapping overhead. The cold seized his body like a vice. He didn't feel the impact when one round grazed his shoulder. He only felt the weight of the man he was carrying. dead by the time they reached the reeds. He crawled onto the muddy bank, gasping. Behind him, the remnants of his group were scattered, some swimming, some sinking, some gone. When dawn came, 12 men were left. They moved west through the forests, avoiding roads, following the sound of artillery in the distance. Once they saw an American reconnaissance plane overhead, a silver glint in the blue sky. For a moment, hope returned, but by evening they ran into another problem: Soviet blocking forces, NKVD troops sweeping the woods for escaping SS men. The first sign was a dog's bark, far off. Then the faint crack of rifles. Amlian whispered, "Spread out. No firing unless we must." But the Russians came fast, disciplined, methodical, fanning through the trees with bayonets and dogs. The firefight lasted minutes. Muzzle flashes tore through the forest gloom. Larson went down with a bullet through his leg. Another man was hit in the back and didn't move. Amlian dragged Larson behind a fallen log, pressed a hand to the wound. "Quiet," he said. "They'll hear." Larson's voice trembled. "Leave me." Amlian shook his head. "We don't leave our own." When the Russians passed, they kept moving, carrying Larson on a makeshift stretcher. Each step was agony. They reached a farmhouse at dusk, an abandoned, half-destroyed. The barn smelled of hay and smoke. Inside, Amlian finally collapsed, exhaustion overtaking discipline. He sat there in the silence, listening to the rain on the roof. Larson stirred weakly. "You think we'll make it?" Amlian looked toward the west, where the sun was sinking behind black clouds. "If we stop, we die. So we keep moving." On the fourth day, they reached the outskirts of Nauen. The town was eerily quiet. No Soviet banners, no German flags. Just silence and burned houses. Amlian sent 2 scouts ahead. When they returned, one was crying. "Americans," he said. "They're here. Tanks with white stars. They've taken the town." The men stared at him, disbelief turning into laughter. Wild, hysterical laughter. They stumbled into the streets, hands raised, weapons thrown aside. American soldiers stepped from behind sandbags, rifles leveled. "Hold it right there," one shouted. "Identify yourselves." Amlian stepped forward, mud-streaked, soaked, his voice raw. "We're done fighting. We're just men." The Americans searched them, stripped them of weapons, and led them to a field where other prisoners sat. Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, even civilians. One American sergeant looked at Amlian's torn collar, saw the faint outline where SS runes had been ripped away. His eyes hardened. "Nordland?" Amlian nodded once. The sergeant spat. "You bastards fought like demons. Half my boys died because of you." Amlian didn't answer. He just looked toward the west, the endless fields glowing under the evening sun. He was alive. For now. That night, as they sat under guard, Amlian finally opened his breast pocket. Inside was the photograph Ziegler had given him before dying, the one of the wife and daughter. He had promised to burn it, but he couldn't. He stared at it in the dim light, the edges stained by river water. The woman's eyes seemed to look right through him. Larson, beside him, whispered, "What happens now?" Amlian folded the photo carefully. "Now we wait, and we remember." He looked back toward the east, toward the red glow still rising above Berlin, faint even from here. "Some men fought for a cause," he said softly. "Some fought for revenge. We fought because there was nowhere left to run." And as the night deepened, the survivors of Nordland sat in silence, the last ghosts of a division that no longer existed, staring at a horizon that promised freedom but offered only memory.
The field near Nauen was quiet except for the rustle of canvas and the distant hum of engines. Rows of prisoners sat in the grass. Wehrmacht men, Luftwaffe remnants, Volkssturm boys barely old enough to shave. They all faced west, as if the horizon itself might forgive them. The Americans ran their temporary camp with efficiency and exhaustion. Soldiers in dusty uniforms, cigarettes dangling from their lips, watched the prisoners without malice, just weariness. The war was ending. The shooting stopped, but the tension in the air was still alive, sharp as static before a storm. For Egil Amlian and the last survivors of SS Nordland, captivity was not safety. It was a verdict waiting to be handed down. They were the enemy's enemy, foreign volunteers of a dying ideology that even the victors whispered about with disgust. To most, they weren't soldiers anymore. They were symbols of fanaticism, of everything the world wanted to erase. The Americans didn't know what to do with them. The Soviets demanded their return. Every foreign SS prisoner was to be handed over for repatriation and punishment. The Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes who had fought for Hitler were traitors in their own homelands. There would be no welcome waiting. When Amlian heard the word repatriation, his stomach turned to ice. They were moved 3 days later, loaded onto trucks bound for a makeshift collection center near Ludwigsfelde. The road was lined with wreckage. Burnt tanks, collapsed bridges, abandoned carts filled with the dead. The Americans sat on the tailgates with rifles across their knees, watching the prisoners with flat, indifferent eyes. Larson leaned close to Amlian. "They'll send us east," he whispered. "To the Russians." Amlian said nothing. He knew it was true. The Yalta agreements had sealed their fate long before they ever reached this place. At the camp, barbed wire surrounded a sea of tents. Inside were thousands, SS, Wehrmacht civilians, all stripped of insignia, all waiting for something they didn't understand. The smell of unwashed bodies and mud filled the air. The guards barked orders in English, barely understood, herding them like cattle. Amlian sat in the dirt, staring at the ground, his thoughts drifting to the faces of those who hadn't made it. Ziegler, Hendrickson, Kjellström, the boy at Wilhelmstrasse. Every death had felt necessary in the moment. Now, it all felt like gravity, inevitable, meaningless. That night, he wrote in the corner of a ration leaflet, "We fought for an idea that became a ruin. We fought for a cause that died before we did. Now we wait for judgment, and maybe that is fair." He folded the scrap and hid it in his boot. Days passed. Rumors spread faster than hunger. Some said the Americans were keeping the Norwegians and Danes for trial. Others whispered that trains were already rolling east, full of men destined for Siberia. Then, one morning, trucks arrived with Soviet officers. The Americans stood aside. The exchange had begun. Prisoners were called by nationality. The first group, Latvians, Estonians, Ukrainians, was taken immediately. The next were the Danes. Amlian watched as his friend Larson was pushed forward, his blond hair catching the morning light. The Swede turned back once, eyes wide with terror. "Egil!" he shouted. "Don't let them—" A rifle butt cut the words short. The Soviets loaded them onto trucks and drove away in silence. When they called Norwegians, Amlian stood slowly. The guard's eyes met his for a moment. A tired American corporal, maybe 20. For a heartbeat, something human flickered there. The corporal muttered, "I'm sorry, buddy," under his breath. Then he waved him on. The journey east began at dusk. The trucks rattled over roads lined with ruins, through villages that smelled of smoke and fear. The Red Army convoys passed them going the opposite direction. Columns of tanks, artillery, men singing victory songs. At a stop near Frankfurt under Oder, Amlian glimpsed the remains of Berlin's skyline in the distance, black against the fading sun. It seemed almost peaceful now, stripped of its noise. They crossed into Soviet hands officially the next morning. The Americans handed over lists, signed papers, saluted, and turned back west. The Russian guards didn't smile. They herded the prisoners into cattle cars, 60 men per wagon. The doors slammed shut, and darkness swallowed them. The only air came from slits near the roof. The floor was covered in straw and filth. Hours turned into days. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned. Men died quietly, curled against the walls. When the train stopped, bodies were dragged out and left beside the tracks. Then it moved again. By the time it reached Brest-Litovsk, half the men were gone. The survivors were taken to a prison camp deep in Poland. Once a German barracks, now under NKVD control. The gates bore a single word painted in white. Судьба. Fate. Amlian was assigned to Barrack 14. The room smelled of rot and old smoke. The windows were nailed shut. The guards wore long coats and dead eyes. Interrogations began the next morning. A Soviet officer, Major Petrov, sat behind a desk in a bare room lit by a single bulb. He spoke through an interpreter. "You are Norwegian. Why did you fight for Hitler?" Amlian hesitated. "I believed I was fighting against communism." Petrov leaned forward. "So you admit you fought against the Soviet Union?" "Yes." "Then you are a war criminal." The pencil scratched across paper. Questions followed. About units, officers, operations in the East. Amlian answered what he could, omitting names, blurring details. It didn't matter. They already knew. When it was over, the interpreter said softly, "You will be sent north. Camp 17, maybe 6 months, maybe 6 years. Depends on your cooperation." Amlian nodded, numb. Winter came early in 1945. Snow covered the camp like a shroud. Men coughed themselves to death in bunks of frozen wood. Food was black bread and soup that tasted of rust. Work details marched out every morning, digging, hauling, repairing, and came back half their number. Through it all, Amlian kept the photograph of Ziegler's family hidden in his jacket lining. It became a talisman, a reminder that somewhere, someone had once lived for more than survival. In the barrack, he met another prisoner, Captain Franz Reuter, a former Wehrmacht engineer. Reuter had seen the collapse of Königsberg, the retreat from the Vistula, the final madness of Hitler's orders. They talked quietly at night, sharing fragments of bread and memory. Reuter said, "You were SS, weren't you?" Amlian nodded slowly. Reuter studied him. "You don't look like a fanatic." "I was once," Amlian said. "Now I'm just cold." Reuter smiled faintly. "That's what the war does." It freezes whatever soul we had left. Years passed, like days. The seasons blurred. Men disappeared into the forest work camps and never came back. In 1948, word spread. Norway wanted its citizens returned. The Soviets agreed to release a few. Names were read out once a month. Amlian listened every time, heart pounding, but his never came. By 1950, he had stopped counting. Then one morning, without explanation, a guard shouted his name. He was handed a slip of paper stamped in red. Release authorized. Repatriation. He didn't believe it until the train crossed into Finland. When he stepped onto Norwegian soil for the first time in 10 years, the air smelled of pine and rain. He looked up at the mountains, gray under the clouds, and felt nothing. A police officer met him at the border. "You'll be taken to Oslo," he said. "There'll be a trial." Amlian nodded. Of course there would be. In Oslo, the court was small, the spectators fewer. The newspapers called him the last traitor. He stood before the judges in a plain gray coat, his face hollow from years of hunger. The prosecutor read from the record. "You served in the SS Nordland Division, a unit responsible for atrocities in the East. Do you deny this?" Amlian answered softly. "No, but I didn't commit them. I fought as a soldier." The prosecutor's eyes were cold. There's no difference anymore. When the verdict came, 10 years hard labor, sentence commuted for time served in Soviet captivity, the courtroom murmured. He was free, technically, but freedom had no meaning left. That night, he walked the streets of Oslo. Neon lights reflected in the wet pavement. Young couples laughed outside cafes. Music drifted from open doors. The world had moved on. He passed a shop window and caught his reflection. Gaunt, gray-haired, eyes like glass. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. From his pocket, he took Ziegler's photograph. The paper was nearly transparent now, the faces fading. He stared at it under the streetlight. Then finally, after 10 years, he let it go, released it into the wind. It fluttered down the gutter, vanishing into the darkness. Amlian turned toward the harbor. Ships sat moored under the drizzle, their lights trembling on the black water. Somewhere beyond, the world he'd fought for was gone, burned out of history. He whispered to the wind. We all stood too long, and in that moment, the echo of Berlin, the screams, the smoke, the sound of crumbling stone seemed to fade at last. The war did not end in a moment. It faded, like smoke after a fire, leaving only silence and the faint smell of what had burned. In the summer of 1945, Berlin was a ghost city, a maze of blackened ruins, hollow windows staring like sockets from skulls. Grass grew between the bricks of the Unter den Linden. The Tiergarten, once a park, was a graveyard of tanks and trees torn apart by shells. The rivers ran brown with soot and oil, and yet, from somewhere in the rubble, life began to return, slow, uncertain, unwilling. Amid that ruin, the last surviving remnants of the SS Nordland Division were ghosts who still walked unseen. Most had vanished into Soviet camps or were dead along the roads. But a few, the ones who had escaped through the chaos or slipped into false identities, wandered the ruins of a lost empire. Haunted by what they had done, what they had believed, Egil Amlian returned to Berlin one last time in 1948, traveling under a false name. He said it was for work, but that wasn't true. It was to see the city where his youth had ended, to stand again where the world had died. He found the zoo flak tower half demolished. The Soviets had blown it apart the previous year. The concrete walls cracked open like bones. Inside, pigeons nested where once there had been guns. The air smelled of rust and dust and rain. He climbed the ruined stairwell, boots echoing in the emptiness, until he reached the roof, or what was left of it. From there, he could see the city stretching endlessly, divided now between east and west, flags of two new worlds fluttering over the ruins. For a long time, he stood there, motionless, remembering the shouting, the smoke, Ziegler's last words, "Then we hold for ourselves." He whispered them again, barely audible over the wind. We held, and it cost everything. Down in the streets, Berliners were rebuilding. Brick by brick, wall by wall, women in scarves cleared rubble with their bare hands. Children played among the ruins with helmets for toys. Soviet soldiers stood guard at intersections, watching with suspicion and boredom. To them, the war was already history. To men like Amlian, it was a wound that would never close. He walked the streets of Wilhelmstrasse, past the foundations of the old chancellery. Nothing remained, only piles of brick and the faint smell of mold and ash. He knelt and ran his fingers over a fragment of marble, still blackened by fire. Amlian thought of Ziegler's photograph, the one he had finally let go in Oslo, and for the first time, he felt the quiet weight of peace, not as a blessing, but as penance. That evening, he visited the cemetery at Halensee, where unmarked graves stretched into the trees. The caretaker said most were from 1945. Soldiers buried by civilians after the fighting, names lost, identities burned away. He stood before one mound, marked only by a weathered cross. The inscription read simply, "Ein unbekannter Soldat," An unknown soldier. He thought of Larsen, Madsen, Kjellstrom, all of them swallowed by the river, the forest, the war. Unknown, like this. He reached into his coat and took out a folded scrap of paper, the last thing he had kept from captivity. The ration leaflet he'd written on in Ludwigsfelde. He read it again in the dim light. We fought for an idea that became a ruin. We fought for a cause that died before we did. He placed it on the grave, weighed it down with a stone, and whispered, "Now it's yours." Night came slowly. The city lights flickered to life. A new Berlin, alien and divided. On one side, the hammer and sickle. On the other, the stars and stripes. Amlian walked to the river's edge, where the spree caught the glow of both flags reflected together in the current. He remembered the night he had crossed that same river under fire, when every light meant death. Now the lights meant something else. Not hope, not forgiveness, but endurance. The world had gone on. Behind him, a group of children were singing post-war street songs, rough and joyful. He turned, watching them skip past the ruins, laughing. For a moment, it felt like the city itself was learning to breathe again. He smiled faintly. "So that's what we bought," he murmured. "Not victory, just the chance to start over." Years passed. By 1960, the Cold War had built new walls where old ones had fallen. The Berlin Wall rose, cutting through neighborhoods, slicing the city like a scar reopened. Amlian watched it on the news from a small apartment in Oslo. He was older now, gray-haired, stooped, working quietly at a dockyard. He never married. He never joined any veterans groups. One morning, he received a letter, a simple envelope, no return address. Inside was a photograph, old and faded. It showed a group of soldiers in the ruins of Berlin, standing behind a makeshift barricade. He recognized them instantly, his squad from Nordland, captured by some long-lost war photographer in April '45. There they were, Nielsen, Larsen, Ziegler in the center, his hand on a map, the firelight touching his face. On the back, written in a shaky hand, were 4 words. They said we were insane. Amlian stared at it for a long time. Then he pinned it inside his drawer, next to a page from a calendar marked with a single date, April 30th, 1945. The day the old world burned. When he died in 1972, the newspaper ran a short obituary. Egil Amlian, 50, former merchant seaman, passed away peacefully in Oslo, survived by no immediate family. They never mentioned the war, but in a small box among his belongings, they found an envelope labeled Berlin. Inside were 3 items: a Soviet dog tag engraved with numbers worn smooth by time, a torn SS collar patch, folded neatly, and a photograph, the same one that had been mailed to him years before. Behind it, in faded pencil, was a final note. "We believed the world ended with us, but it didn't. It began again without us." Somewhere in Berlin, long after, workers demolishing the last sections of the Zuflack Tower found fragments of personal belongings embedded in the concrete. Buttons, cartridge cases, a half-melted watch. One piece stood out, a brass cigarette case, dented and blackened. Inside, still legible after 30 years, were the initials JZ scratched into the lid. The foreman handed it to the museum staff, who placed it in a glass case labeled simply, "Recovered from the Flakturm Zoo, April 1945. Visitors walk past it every day now, unaware that within that small piece of metal lies the echo of a division that fought its last stand for nothing but survival. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind sweeps through the Tiergarten and the city hums with the sound of new life, you might almost hear it again, the distant thunder of guns, the shouted orders in a dozen foreign tongues, the heartbeat of men who refused to surrender. They called it madness. They called it loyalty. History called it the end. But for those who were there, for the last defenders of the Nordland Division, it was simply the only thing left to do, to stand, until there was nothing left to stand for.